Man Garwood, like Nicole mentioned, and I'm going to start off this presentation and then turn it over to Katie a little ways in. I'm going to give sort of a more broad program overview and how the wetland monitoring program fits into Michigan's overall wetland program, and then Katie will dive deeper into more of the technical information about Michigan's wetland monitoring program. Go ahead and advance the slide. Okay, so big picture view, many of you probably are familiar with Michigan's wetland program, but Michigan Wetlands Protection Act was passed all the way back in 1979, and shortly after that, Michigan assumed administration of the Clean Water Act, Section 404 program in 1984. So for over 40 years now, Michigan's regulatory wetland program has served as a national model of effective resource protection and streamlining regulations for over 40 years. Many of you also know that Michigan Wetlands Protection Act was written specifically to support state assumption of the federal Section 404 program. Go ahead and next slide, Katie. Okay. All right. But I wanted to take a step back and talk about, even though you may be very familiar with our regulatory program, the wetland program in Michigan does follow the EPA state and tribal wetland programs four core elements framework. So state and tribal wetland programs are intended to have four of these core elements, which include wetlands monitoring and assessment, wetlands regulation, voluntary wetland restoration and protection, and wetland water quality standards. Michigan's program actually does include all four of these, and today we are going to focus on that monitoring and assessment portion. Okay, in 2015, Michigan published our State of Michigan Wetland Monitoring and Assessment Strategy. This was developed as an addendum to the Michigan Surface Water Monitoring Strategy. On the screen, you can see a screenshot of both of these two documents. The Surface Water Monitoring Strategy was recently updated in 2025. The Wetland Monitoring and Assessment Strategy is still our 2015 version of that document. This strategy is focused on monitoring and assessing the quantity and quality of wetlands throughout Michigan, developing status and trends information, and it identifies ways to evaluate the regulatory program using monitoring and assessment. Go ahead. EPA has developed a three-tiered technical approach to monitoring and assessment programs for wetlands, and our wetland monitoring strategy follows this three-tiered approach. Level 1 assessment includes landscape level assessment. This is using GIS and remote sensing tools to assess landscape, spatial quantity and quality of wetlands. It includes landscape level wetland functional assessment, NWI, those kinds of things. And we'll dive deeper into the strategy in just a minute. The level 2, which many of you are probably familiar with, is rapid wetland assessment. Our assessment strategy does include rapid wetland assessment through the use of the Michigan Rapid Assessment Method, or MIRAM. And then level 3 is the intensive site assessment. This is what many people are familiar with, where you spend a lot of time on site actually gathering data in a wetland, and this will be the focus of today's discussion. Our monitoring and assessment strategy does include several objectives related to level 3 intensive site assessment as well. Go ahead. Okay. The Michigan Wetland Monitoring and Assessment Strategy includes 8 objectives. The first 4 objectives are focused on that level 1 landscape level assessment. Objective 1 is to inventory Michigan's wetland resources. Objective 2 is to update the National Wetland Inventory for use in status and trends reporting. Objective 3 is tracking permitted impacts and mitigation, as well as unauthorized impacts. These are done through MyEnviro. And then Objective 4 is application of landscape level wetland assessment on a watershed scale. And we do implement landscape level wetland functional assessment by watershed in Michigan as well. At that level 2 rapid assessment method is objective 5. The use of Michigan rapid assessment method to assess wetland functions and values regardless of ecological type. And then the level 3 intensive site assessment relates to objectives 6 through 8. Objective 6 being the use of indices of biological integrity, or IBIs, and related methods to monitor wetlands. Objective 7 is to provide for the evaluation of Michigan's most outstanding wetland resources, especially Great Lakes coastal wetlands. And then Objective 8, to assess statewide wetland quality through routine wetland monitoring program that includes the National Wetland Condition Assessment. Go ahead, Katie. So, Michigan's wetland assessment and monitoring, intensive level monitoring, includes primarily what we're going to focus on today, what we call the Michigan Wetland Monitoring Program or project. This program was in development for several years, but the field work incorporating the methods that we're going to talk about today began in 2016. We operate this program on 5-year cycles. So the first 5-year cycle was really 2015 to 2020, then 21 to 25, and now we are in the third 5-year cycle of wetland monitoring. This monitoring method also aligns with application of the National Wetland Condition Assessment, and we use funding from EPA through the National Wetland Condition Assessment and intensification funding for that project. And we'll talk just a little bit about that as well. So the National Aquatic Resource Surveys are statistical surveys done across the country to assess the status of and the changes in quality of the nation's waters. This includes coastal, lakes and reservoirs, rivers and streams, and wetlands. These are done across the country, and they're done at a scale that allows comparison of the results from different parts of the country and between years. The National Aquatic Resource Surveys are done, they're funded through EPA and headed by EPA, who works with state, tribal, and federal partners to design and implement these surveys. There are the 4 categories I mentioned: the National Coastal Condition Assessment, the National Lakes Assessment, the National Rivers and Streams Assessment, and then the National Wetland Condition Assessment, which is the one that we participate in through the Wetland Monitoring Program. And then I've included on this screen just a screenshot from the EPA National Wetland Condition Assessment web pages. This is a snapshot of the findings of the 2021 report. Keep in mind that the information on this screen is across the country. So they assessed wetlands in every state across the country to develop this kind of course level information on biological indicators, response, physical alterations, and chemical indicators, giving really a snapshot in time of the condition of the nation's wetlands. We participate in this every 5 years when the National Wetland Condition Assessment comes around. And we will be doing it this year in 2026. Go ahead, Katie. So I've teed it up, and Katie will take it from here, diving deeper into the specific protocols we use in Michigan. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So as Anne mentioned, we coordinate with the national surveys. And so in the Michigan Wetland Monitoring Program, our protocols are pulled from that national version. That way we can use the sites that we survey for the national surveys to supplement our state data. And so we have apples to apples comparison on their protocols, which include verifying the point that we're surveying, verifying the assessment area of the survey area. We follow their vegetation protocol, which is recording species as well as other ground surface attributes. And then in addition to doing these national protocols, we also implement MyRAM at each of the sites that we do survey. So we have built a large cache of MyRAM site data. We do alter a little bit the setup of the MyRAM. So it is a little altered from a typical MIRAM just because we're only assessing our assessment area and not the entire wetland or a larger region. But I can expand on that in a later slide. But those are the protocols that we follow. And then here's some of our wetland monitoring staff in action on sites. And in addition to the protocols that we implement, we also partner with Central Michigan University, and they assist us in sampling sites that have sufficient area and depth of water. And what they survey on those sites with water is macroinvertebrate sites. So in the field, they conduct a dip netting and timed pick count of the macroinvertebrates and return to the lab to perform the IDs. They also take some basic water chemistry in the field and temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, and so on, you can see there. And they also collect water to return back to the lab for further chemical analysis. So as I mentioned, we follow the national protocols for our point verification and our assessment area. So here's an example of a site layout. In the image there, the green dot is the center. That's the point that we're trying to reach. We'll lat long a specific spot in this wetland. Lay out a 2-hectare circle, which is a 40-meter radius. We set up directional transects, so a north-south, east-west transects from the center, and establish our vegetation plots. So again, point verification means once we get to the site, is it wetland? Can it be sampled? Is the assessment area large enough to be sampled? Are there any obstacles or things that might make you have to alter that assessment area? And so that is a specific setup that we would have to follow. As you can see in this image, the green dot is the point, that kind of pinkish magenta circle around it, that's your 40-meter radius. Just outside of that, the blue dotted circle, that's a 60-meter radius. And that forms two functions. That is, if we have to shift a point, because once we arrive on site, for example, there's not wetland at the point, but we could potentially move the point over to a new location. We do have that 60-meter buffer area in which to shift our point around if we do realize once we are to the site, hey, we're on a ridge, we're on an upland area. So we do have that wiggle room. And then the larger red circle is an expanded buffer area for the national surveys where we actually collect data on those buffers. And in this image here, the yellow is the NWI polygon. And so this is just an image. Once we get to that center point, we establish our survey area. So you can see where those tape measures cross. That is approximately where our center of our survey area would be located. And as you can see, we kind of have some ribbons tied off to the tree, so we can kind of always guide ourselves back to the middle. These particular sites are fairly open, but as wetland professionals, you can imagine some of the thicker sites we get to. So being able to get back to the center is pretty important certain days. So again, our plot layout. This is on the left there, that's our standard plot layout. That's assuming you've got enough room in your wetland that you're surveying that you can establish that 40-meter circle and have all of those plots laid out in that standard format. So that is the basic. That is how we should set up if it is possible. So you see there, you've got 5 plots. You've got your north, south, east, west transects. Each plot is located along one of the transect lines and spaced apart in various distances. On the right, you can see that there's some kind of alternate plot layout. So as part of the protocol, they do provide some suggested layouts for sites that don't conform to that standard circle. For example, narrower wetlands that don't have the width to actually set up 40 meters. And so again, you have to make do with what is out there in the field, but at the same time, it is best to try to fit that conforming layout if at all possible. And then also make sure you have some distance between your plots as you lay them out. And then here are some examples in the field. Once we get out to a site and realize that it's not a standard circle, the first thing that we do once we do locate the point and determine that the point is wetland and the point in the assessment area is large enough to be surveyed, that we will sketch out our alternate plot layout. Usually take a photo of it on your phone so you can reference it back to it as you kind of go through the survey. But yes, this is one of the first things that we're doing once we do reach that point in the field. So once we establish our point, set up our plots, we begin our vegetation sampling. So what we look at when we're sampling vegetation is species data and our species presence and percent cover. We'll also we're looking at every single species that is present on the site. So just consider that. Oftentimes as wetland professionals, we go out and we're listing dominant species, but in this case, we will be identifying or recording at least every species that is present on the site and identifying all of those that can be identified. Things that cannot be identified in the field will be collected and identified later. Luckily, we do contract with Great Lakes Environmental Center for some great botanists, and so they are the ones that actually get into that species identification. I know my plants, but I don't know all my plants. So that is one of the biggest things that takes the time on the sites is that species presence and percent cover. So once we've collected our plant list, we actually go back and see for each of the plots how much percent cover and what's the predominant height class of those species. We also look at all of the vegetation as a whole and estimate the percent cover by vertical strata. So that's your height classes. So do we have a pretty bare forest floor that used to be a vernal pool, doesn't have much coverage, but you have a high canopy cover? So we're breaking down the cover by vertical strata. Otherwise, sometimes you've got your emergent that has 100% coverage at that shortest, 0 to a half a meter height class. So we make that estimate for each of the plots. We then look at things like bryophytes, your mosses, your lichens, your algae. What is the coverage of those on the ground surface and on logs and rocks on the ground? We also evaluate the coverage on the trees of lichens and bryophytes. We look at other ground surface attributes. That includes things like leaf litter, so your percent cover of leaf litter and predominant type, including coniferous, deciduous, herbaceous, graminoid. We also look at percent of water cover and depth of water, presence of things like rocks, gravel. We don't have that very commonly in Michigan wetlands, but it is something that we evaluate. We count up and estimate the DBH or diameter breast height of our standing dead trees, those snags that provide great habitat. And then from our species list, we actually take the tree species and break those down into coverage and counts. So we, again, evaluate the tree species for their percent cover at each of the height classes. So do we have just a layer of some saplings that are, or seedlings and saplings that are low to the ground, or do we have, tall trees providing a great canopy cover? And then also for the tree trunks, we do count and size them by diameter breast height. On the right here, we have an image of how we set up our vegetation plots. They're 10 by 10 meter vegetation plots, so 100 square meters. And you can see these two nested plots in the northeast and southwest corners. So we have a small nested plot, which is 1 square meter, and then a medium nested plot, which is 10 square meters. So what we do is start the day surveying pick a corner, any corner, and do that 1 by 1 square meter plot and list all the species presence in that 1 square meter. We then expand out to the 10 square meter and say, hey, what else can we find in this corner? And additionally list all of those species. Then we pop over to the other corner and start over again. We start our plant list for that corner from scratch. again, we've got our plant list already started, so hopefully we've already got some plants on the list that we'll be similarly finding. But again, we're starting in that other corner and doing that same thing, going out to the medium, finding what else we can find. And then after that, we go into the remaining, that white space in that image. That's when we survey the rest of the plants. This is, again, part of the NWA protocol. So that is not something that we've established, but we do find that that really does help us, like literally get into the weeds. It really helps you focus your search on a pretty small scale so you can be keyed in and find all of those additional species that aren't just the dominants. So for example, this is just an example of a plot. In the foreground here, the yellow, that is our transect tape. We just use 100-meter measuring tapes and lay those out. So that's one of our east-west transects. The rope here establishes our 100 square meter square. The smaller rope here establishes our 10-meter square. And then we just use a 1 meter length of PVC pipe with an elbow crook to establish our 1 square meter that we evaluate. So we've got our 1 square meter, that's where we start, bounce out to our 10-meter square, hit the other corner, and then you can see our botanist Dan here. He is present in what we call the hole. So that's that remaining white space in that protocol. And as you can see here, we've got a nice wetland with some snags, but those snags happen to be outside of this plot. You've got some down woody debris that's, again, outside of this plot. So we're surveying just within those survey plots, which is pretty important when you're at a site that has some things that, you know, when you're collecting the data, you have to be specifically in those plots. And again, this is the same site, just a different plot. And you can see, again, you just happen to have in this plot area, you don't happen to have standing dead trees, but they do occur on the site. So that does get tricky when you feel like you're not necessarily collecting the data, but you have to follow the protocol. One nice thing is that we do the MyRAM on all the sites, which does manage to capture some of that type of data. So again, you see here, this is the 1 square meter and then the 10 square meter. And then you can't see the remainder of the rope for the 100 square meter. As I mentioned, we do a MyRAM at all of the sites. Those are hopefully you're familiar with the MyRAM. MWA does provide training on occasion for the MyRAM, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested in learning more. Basically what it is 7 metrics for measuring what we call the wetland functional value. Wetlands provide lots of different functions on the landscape and are valuable in lots of different ways. And this measures lots of different things to try to assign a number value to that wetland. A number value on its own doesn't mean much, but typically what we do is when you're comparing wetland types, wetlands to each other, hopefully that can tell you a little bit more of the story. You can see those 7 different metrics. I won't really get into that. But as I mentioned, our wetland size and distribution, that first thing is when you're establishing your review area for the MyRAM. We do have a specific way we establish our review area and our wetland size that does differ a little bit from a standard MyRAM. So again, the MyRAM data we collect for this program wouldn't necessarily be used apples to apples, but it certainly could guide some information for comparing sites. So how do we choose our sites? Lots of people think, hey, like, are we monitoring things like a mitigation site, right? A lot of folks out there monitor for different reasons, for a restoration site, a mitigation site. These sites are simply wetlands on the landscape. They're selected based on the NWI polygons. We use the most recent polygons available to come up with that site list. And then from there, from those polygons, points are randomly generated. We do here in Michigan separate them by region. At the national scale, of course, they've got 50 different states to worry about, so they just randomly select the points by state, but we further refine that to by the region of the state. And then from there, once we have our list of points, we've got some kind of office work to do to figure out who the property owner is, reach out to them to request permission, do some aerial interpretation. Hey, is this even a wetland, or is it a wetland that's surveyable? We, of course, many people know like a deep water pond will come up as an NWI polygon, but we do have a limit to the water depth of what we can survey for this program. So we do have to evaluate for that. We evaluate things like access. Are there gates that we need to kind of coordinate having the owner give us access to the site? Most sites in Michigan aren't landlocked, but sometimes to get into some of those deeper sites, especially consider things like state forests, national forests, some of your larger parcels that once you get to where you can park your car and have to start going off by foot, you need to be able to access. These sites, these surveys are designed to be completed in one day. So we do need to be able to get out to the point, complete the survey, and get back and have that all be done in a day. So I have kind of figured out that there's certainly a distance, especially in things that are like cedar swamps or tag alder swamps that are pretty uniform on an aerial image, that that does impact our evaluation of which sites we select. So again, it is done by this random generation. A lot of times we'll reach out to a property owner and they'll say, hey, that wetland's not so great. I've got this other wetland somewhere else on the property. That's the cool one. You should survey that. And unfortunately, we just can't pick and choose. The randomness of the generation of these points is part of coming up with data that hasn't been specialized to only survey the cool wetlands or the ones that have interesting things in them. So here's our site distribution. Here's a map that shows all the sites that we've surveyed so far. We have not hit every county yet, even though we've been doing the survey for 10 years. I'd like to complete the map and hit a point in every county of the state. So that's a future goal. So the goal is to do 100 sites per 5-year cycle. So what we do is on the years that we do the national version of the sampling, we do include that data again because we've followed the same protocols. So we do include those towards our site count. But in addition to those 100 unique sites, we also do a subset of sites that we revisit in a separate year. And so that's to collect some more short-term data of site changes. And then, as I mentioned, we've got our lovely state broken down into 3 ecoregions. So we do attempt to have our site numbers distributed pretty evenly across those 3 ecoregions. So we've got our southern lower up into that climactic tension zone, our northern lower, and then of course, the upper peninsula stands alone. And if you're interested in seeing those sites yourself, there is a layer on the Wetlands Map Viewer on EGLE's website. And so you can turn on those layers and see the site distribution. So there you go there. Feel free to check that out. We do have some limited information associated with the monitoring data that we've collected that does pop up when you do click on those little triangles there. You zoom in and click on a triangle, and on that left panel of the screen, you'll have all the information that comes up, that typically comes up, but in addition, you'll see the monitoring information. And on a site like this, we've surveyed it once, so 1 result is found. On sites that you might have surveyed more than once, you'll have 2 or more results. The data we include so far: site name, year that we've surveyed, region of the state, wetland type, species count, and the number of non-native species found on a site. So again, pretty limited survey data that we've decided to kind of have in this public-facing way. We kind of certainly are open in considering what type of additional data might be relevant and simple enough to include in this, but that data is available for the public to kind of check out. We do collect all of our data on an app, and so we've got a database that houses all the information. So as you can see here, we've got different columns, date of the site inspection, the site name, those headers there go along again with that point verification, the assessment area, the different vegetation forms that we fill out, the MyRAM data, and then summary of the site. So that's how we house our data. The database has the functionality to run some reports, and so I'll get into some of the results on that. So for that first round, as Anne mentioned, that first round that didn't begin until 2016, but technically was a 2015 to 2019 cycle. There's a report for that, so hopefully that will be posted on our website soon. It's a preliminary finding of that first cycle. It really doesn't speak much to the data beyond just having a baseline to kind of inform what we kind of compare to from there, and what type of data to track for trends. So again, being that first cycle with just those first 100 sites, we didn't do too much into the nitty gritty on that report, but you can see that baseline information of what we've been collecting so far. Vascular species. So let's get into some of the data. What's our species counts that we most commonly see? We've got here kind of the bar graphs of how many species that are recorded and how many sites we commonly see, kind of those kind of buckets, 0 to 30, 31 to 60, and so on. And just like I mentioned, consider when you're going out to a site and you make a species list of your predominant species, or even all of the species that you might find, how long are those lists? How often do you have lists that kind of bump up over that 100 species threshold? Hey, it's not even that very common for us with this intensive sampling. I do typically kind of call out, hey, we've hit 100, because that's a great milestone on a long day to kind of mention and celebrate, but also, hey, stop finding things. Just kidding. Of course, the data is what it is, and so we continue to collect the data as we find it. But yes, those become pretty long days. And as you can see, the minimum number of species that we found on a site was 9, and the maximum number of species was 134. So it's pretty broad range. The mean is 58. Just based on my own experience, that feels right. That sounds right. And then on the graph here, that 83 species or 83 sites that have 31 to 60 species. Again, that feels pretty correct for the time I've spent in the field. But 31 to 60 and 61 to 90, yeah, that's the typical of what we're finding for species count. A site that has only 9 species, what might you expect to see? Well, this is the species with the lowest, or this is the site with the lowest number of species. This has 9 species. It's a pretty great looking site. It's in Hiawatha National Forest, in the west end of Hiawatha and Schoolcraft County. It's a leatherleaf bog. And if you're familiar with leatherleaf bogs, you know that doesn't typically have a high species diversity. You can probably list, your leatherleaf, your kalmia, some of your sedge, your wire sedge species. This site happened to have 2 different bladderwort species in the water there. But yeah, we maxed out at 9. Pretty cool spot. Low diversity does not mean a poor quality wetland. A lot of us from the southern end of the state would look at this and be pretty excited about it. Maybe those of you up in the UP don't blink an eye at this, but pretty cool site. 9 species might sound like it'd be a fast day, but a site like this with all of the leatherleaf hummocks, standing water to kind of manage to work within and around, might not be a fast sampling day necessarily, but certainly not a lot of confusion for your species list. And then on the other end, what might a site that has 134 species look like? And so that's our 134 species site. That's also in the Hiawatha. That's on the east end of the Hiawatha in Mackinac County. This site here is not far off of Lake Huron. Just this image alone, I think, demonstrates how busy the site is. You can see there the orange ribbon that denotes the center point. And once we got out to that center point, the botanists kind of just sighed and just knew just from the blink of an eye that, hey, this is going to be a site with a high species count. By the time we were done with the first plot, we had found 70 species just in that first plot. This site also happened to have some good interspersion with some wet meadow type habitat. Also had an area that was closer to an upland transitional zone, so a little more facultative species coming in on one of the plots. So that type of diversity of plots does tend to bump up your species count pretty greatly. In that previous site image, there other than the open water versus the leatherleaf area, that wasn't didn't have a ton of other interspersion, whereas this one really did have, each plot had something to add. On this site, these folks, they were not very impressed that we had 134 species to claim. We definitely had these little cedar waxwing babies. As I was setting up a plot, I noticed that their parent or guardian was being very attentive and didn't seem to like me being there. So I knew I had to keep an eye out and find that nest. And yes, there was the nest established within our plot, actually. But they didn't seem to be too bothered after a few moments. So those little guys, some of the cool stuff I get to see in the field doing this type of work. So tree counts, tree cover, what some of the data that we found on tree observations. Fraxinus pennsylvanica, or Fraxpen, that's green ash. That happens to be the second most frequently found tree species on sites that have trees. So even with the severe losses from having the emerald ash borer kind of decimate the state, we're still seeing, especially young, frax come up from the seed bank. So we do have a good seed bank still there. Hopefully some of these seedlings and saplings do grow into full-size reproductive trees that continue on the landscape. But that is just something interesting, that we're still seeing them as the second most frequently found species in our wetlands that we've surveyed. So take that with what you will. I think it sounds like good news. Hopefully, as they grow, they hold on and kind of repopulate the landscape. Acer rubrum, red maple, that's our most frequently found tree. And it also typically has a high percent cover. So not only do we find it a lot in wetland just as being present, but it also typically has a good canopy cover. And then in the previous cycle alone, so this data here is over across the entire survey timeframe. Maybe I should preface that. So this Fraxinus and Acer rubrum data is from the 10 years total. But if we look at just the 2015 to 2019 cycle, the highest mean percent cover was silver maple. As many of you can kind of picture, those large, big silver maples that kind of take over the canopy of wetlands. That had a much higher canopy cover with an average of 17.9, but it actually fell out of the top 10. So that little nugget of information fell away in this current round when looking at the data as a whole. So here's our list of our top 10 tree species. You might notice that we do have a number of upland species present in the top 10. What is Quercus rubra, red oak? What is that doing as number 4? Well, what we find is a lot of times, hey, where the acorn lands and the seedling pops up, we have to record that as a tree that we found. Will that seedling grow into a full-size tree? It might not be able to manage the wetter conditions of a forested wetland to kind of grow up into a full-size tree. So wait and see on those. And then also to consider that when we're collecting data on the presence of a species in our plot, the branches that overhang do get counted. So if we have a red oak that's rooted outside of a wetland and branching in, that will be recorded. So we do have those kind of two different aspects to collecting the data. So that's why we do happen to see some of these upland species in the frequent tree counts. And then also consider their mean percent cover. You can see in that column of percent cover, none of those upland species, your white pine or your black cherry, for example, those don't have high coverage percentages. So again, they're present but not dominant. So even in our more mesic wetlands that we might survey, those aren't your predominant coverage. So non-native species. And to specify, this discusses non-native species, so this is not invasive species. So keep that in mind as these next couple slides. So for the top 10 most frequently observed non-native species, only 2 have a high relative percent cover. And when I say relative percent cover, that's because coverages overlap on a site. So of those most frequently found non-native species, our glossy buckthorn and our common buckthorn are the only ones that really have any significant percent cover. And a lot of our non-native species, again, similar to the tree list, is we have a lot of non-native species that aren't wetland rated, especially on wetlands that might get drier later in the year or don't have that near surface inundation or saturation where some of those plants can take hold later in the season. So again, we definitely have lots of sites that have no non-native species at all present. The maximum is 22. That's quite a large number. But again, that's anything that's not native to Michigan. And on it, the mean being just under 5 species per site, that seems probably, based on my experience in the field, that seems about right. Again, this is our top 10 list of non-native species. And, that bittersweet nightshade at number 1, Taraxacum, that's your common dandelion. Not many people are worried about the presence of a dandelion in a wetland that we're surveying. And also you can see the relative percent cover, for example, 0.07% for your dandelions. I mean, that's just not a high coverage amount, but they do come up on our non-native species list, of course. And you can see some of the other offenders, right? Multiflora rose, your buckthorn species, your autumn olives. So those are certainly present. Poa pratensis, your Kentucky bluegrass, for example. Like I said, some of these species aren't the ones that are really having the high percent coverage or doing much damage to the health of a wetland, for example. Water cover. So we estimate the percent coverage of water. We estimate the water depth. This is just a quick snapshot of the percent water cover on the sites over time. We do see a general trend line of getting less percent water cover. And again, is that something that's telling us that things are getting drier, or is this too soon? I think that just doing this first 10 years of sites might not be enough to show that trend is truly anything that is important, because things like site selection play into some of that as well. Time of year certainly is a factor. Hitting sites earlier in the season where you do have more water on site. So that's just, again, something that we're tracking, and is, again, something that's an important trend if we do continue to see things, in one direction or another. And then circling back to the MIRAM scores. And this scatter plot here just shows your MIRAM score against your species count. And again, just at those previous examples of those sites that had, only 9 species, but you might imagine a site like that might not score too low on a MIRAM because it might have some other cool features to it that aren't just your species count. So you do see a general trend of the MIRAM scores increasing as the species number increases. And because MIRAM collects data on lots of things like your interspersion or other habitat features that might allow for increased diversity, you might expect to see a general trend of an increase based on species count. But as you can see, it's not a huge increase in that trend line. So species count alone isn't the thing. You can see that some of the higher species count, you know, have a range of MIRAM scores. Some of those lower outliers, that lowest MIRAM score of 9.5. If you're familiar with MIRAMs, there's sites that can get negative points, and this one got the scores for both the negative points. Had some recent disturbance that kept those points pretty low. So again, some of those lower scores are pretty unique. They're kind of outliers there. Average MIRAM scores for the sites that we've surveyed is 60. So again, just like a little snapshot of some of that information. And then just looking ahead, as Ann mentioned, this year we're participating in the national survey, so kind of getting ramped up for that. We'd like to push our new website out, but secondary to having the updated website, to also develop a story map. We've got a lot of cool information on sites that is kind of beyond what we're showing on the Wetlands map viewer, for example. It'd be nice to kind of feature some site photos and things like that. And then just continue to add improvements and database improvements to improve our reporting functionality. Every time we try to run some reports, we find out a little bit more of what we would like the reporting functionality to provide to us that might not be quite there. So we'd like to continue to improve some of that functionality as well. So with that, if people have questions, comments, insights, I'd like to open it up.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you, Anne. At this time, please submit any questions that you have in writing using that Q&A function. So far, we have two. So Katie and Anne, I'm going to read them off and answer as you wish. The first question, is there a more recent NWCA protocol than the 2021 set available on the EPA's website?
That has not been posted yet. There's still, as we're in planning for the 2026 survey, we have not received that current 2026 version of the protocol list. I will say in the plannings that we've done so far, they've not indicated any significant changes from the 2021 protocols. So we do anticipate them being more or less the same. So again, but wait to see once they do come out if there's any tweaks to the protocols.
Great, thank you. Another question. How do you account for invasive species within the surveys?
Yeah, and that is a really great question. And as I mentioned at the end there, kind of reporting functionality is that we do have a reporting can pull out those non-native species data, but it's not yet set up to kind of separate out invasives. So that is something that in the future we want to be able to report out. And so we have to kind of create that functionality within the database. But yes, definitely something that we've noticed and that should be addressed because, as I mentioned, non-native means one thing and invasive is a separate concern, right?
Totally. Another question. Are drones becoming more useful in this program, or could they be useful?
I wish for drones kind of often on a site that is difficult to traverse, or sometimes when something's just got your head spinning to estimate percent coverage, for example. You just want to take an overhead view and look down. So we have not implemented drones. That's not part of the national protocol, so I don't expect that to be incorporated into Michigan surveys. And then also just use of drones is very, very specific in EGLE's work. Having proper permissions, having a drone operator that's certified. There's lots of boxes to be checked when using a drone on any site. So I honestly don't anticipate us implementing them in the short term on surveys. As I mentioned, I don't believe the national surveys are doing much consideration of using them at all. And so we'll follow their protocols.
All right. Now, a lot of us are in the field, And one viewer is wondering if we can MyRAM the wetlands that we manage and have that contribute to a larger data set, MyRAM being a verb.
Yes, it's a verb. So sites that you manage, that would not contribute to this program. As I mentioned, the site selection being randomly generated and all of that has to follow that protocol. So any additional MyRAM data wouldn't be something that we would implement in this larger data set. But I think that certainly there's I think if you have your own sites to manage and you use that for your own site comparison and data set, I think that's great. But again, I don't see that being necessarily incorporated into this particular data set.
Okay, moving on here. The questions are beginning to fizzle out. Here's your last chance to ask a question. One viewer notes that it could be interesting to see the species data broken down by region and in the future by county. Just an observation.
Oh, for sure. And that is something that we do have the ability, and that is something that I just didn't include in this presentation for time, but that is part of the reason that we do have it broken down is because those regions are so different in terms of wetland types and communities, but also so we can hopefully compare by region. Are we seeing more invasive species? Our invasive species in southern Lower Peninsula steady, but now we're seeing an increase in cover in northern Lower Peninsula, for example. So I do think that is a great point, and that's something that while I don't have the information in this presentation, it is something that we have the ability to do and expect to be able to do. So,
Okay. Someone's wondering, where is the data used mostly, and do you have any specific examples of that?
sure. So far, it is just in the reporting that is associated with this project and with our wetlands strategy. So as I mentioned, we would hopefully be posting that initial report online. And looks like you have something to add on connecting this to our assessment strategy.
Sure. I'll kind of just talk about, in general, being one of the four, focus areas of the wetland program, having information that can help us understand the status and trends of wetlands over time, changes that we're seeing, and a better understanding of different wetland types and the features within those is sort of contributing to our wetland program development, right? So, for example, having a better understanding of things like the standing dead trees, leaf litter, interspersion contributes to a better understanding of what makes a functional wetland for wetland restoration or mitigation purposes. We can consider this information when we're looking to make updates to those things. Also, a better understanding of the different kinds of buffers that are out there and their contribution to wetland quality and function. So it's more of a high level at this point. We're using this information to guide our understanding of quality and function of wetlands on the landscape and ensure that as we develop additional protections or we try to identify rare resources or understand how to do restoration and mitigation improved, we're using scientific data. In the future, there could be, like we've been talking about, there will be some enhancements coming to the kind of information provided publicly accessible through the Wetlands Map Viewer, probably. And at that point, it might be easier for individuals to use this information as well. So as of right now, it's not used on a site-specific basis, if that's really kind of the question. It's used more in a program planning and program enhancement perspective.
All right. Well, a big thank you, Katie and Anne, for taking the time to present on this topic today. That's all we have time for. So thank you for all who attended as well, and we will see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.